Yeah, so this lecture is slightly different from the previous ones in as much as it deals with science, and science has always had a rather tense relationship with nationalism, for it has often benefited from both cultures and movements of internationalism. That's been one of its remarkable features. It's indeed a pleasure to introduce Satyajit Rath today. He's a leading immunologist from the National Institute of Immunology. He wears a second hat as the Secretary of the Delhi Science Forum. And as the Secretary of the Delhi Science Forum, he has participated and intervened through his writing and lectures on matters on important issues relating to science and society. Today, Satyajit will speak on biological diversity and what biological diversity means for society and the nations. Satyajit.
धन्यवाद ध्रुव। एक सवाल पूछे, हिंदी में बोले, अंग्रेजी में बोले? अच्छा, बॉम्बे मिक्सचर में बोलते हैं। पहली बात तो ये है कि एक मित्रवर्य ने पूछा जो टीचिंग को फॉलो कर रहे हैं यूट्यूब पे कि यार तुम कितना टाइम लोगे? मैंने कहा क्यों? यार बड़ा अच्छा बोलते हैं लेकिन टाइम बहुत लेते हैं यार, घंटे भर बोले जाते हैं और आखिरकार समझ में आता है कि क्या कह रहे हैं, पहले क्यों नहीं बताते? तो अब जैव वैज्ञानिक हैं, बायोलॉजिस्ट हैं, तो अच्छा, टाइम आउट। लेट मी आस्क अ क्वेश्चन। ध्रुव सेड साइंस हैज कम अप हियर, बट एवरीबडी हु हैज स्पोकन हियर इज फ्रॉम सोशल साइंसेस। तो वो साइंस और ये साइंस क्या अलग है? साइंस तो एक ही नहीं है। I have serious difficulties about this, and we will come back to this as we go along. But to go back to my friend, this is for him. So I'm going to do a little 3-sentence summary कि क्या कहने जा रहा हूं, और घंटे भर नहीं बोलूंगा, चिंता नहीं कीजिएगा, लेकिन आधे घंटे में क्या कहने जा रहा हूं। मैं ये कहने जा रहा हूं कि जब हम सामाजिक व्यासपीठों पर, प्लेटफॉर्म्स, बात करते हैं, जब सामाजिक चर्चे बहस होते हैं, तो कई बार ये सामने आता है कि हम जैव वैज्ञानिक सिद्धांतों का आधार लेते हैं और उन्हें आगे करते हैं कि हम ऐसे हैं, हमारा समाज ऐसा है, हमारे व्यक्तिमत्व ऐसे हैं क्योंकि हमारी बायोलॉजी ही वैसी है। क्या करें, उसके मुताबिक तो चलना ही पड़ेगा ना, निसर्ग नियम है। कई मुद्दों पर यह बात बार बार सामने आती है, एंड आई थिंक दैट इट इज इंपॉर्टेंट फॉर अस टू डिसाइड हाउ वी आर गोइंग टू एड्रेस this position. There are two ways of addressing this position. One way, which is taken by very many of my friends and colleagues in social sciences and humanities, is to say natural science is elitist, it is built into and pervaded by power structures and exploitation, and therefore we are simply going to ignore natural science. And I suggest to you, perhaps with my biases and prejudices, but I suggest to you that this is not necessarily the most sensible thing for us to do in progressive movements. So let me offer you an alternative, and that alternative is to question these easy generalizing mythologies that are being perpetrated in the name of science कहता है। तनिक पूछे तो कि साइंस सचमुच क्या कहता है? So in pursuit of this argument, I'm going to do something that most of my friends over the last half an hour around have expected me not to do. तो मैंने जब पूछा कि भैया क्या बोलें, तो किसी ने कहा कि टॉक अबाउट द हिस्ट्री ऑफ साइंस एंड द ट्रेजेक्टरी ऑफ साइंस, किसी ने कहा जेनेटिक्स और कास्ट जेनेटिक्स के बारे में कहो, जिसके बारे में मैंने और कई जगहों में कुछ ना कुछ कहा हुआ है। मेरी परेशानी ये है कि जब टीचिंग की बात है तो यहां जो खड़ा है, खड़ी हैं, उन्हें आपके सामने रखने के लिए जिस विषय पे बात कर रहे हैं उसमें तनिक सी, थोड़ी सी समझ की बारीकी होनी चाहिए ना। तो भैया अपने विषय में बात करो, दूसरे विषय में नहीं करो जब सिखाने को चाह रहे हो। So what I'm going to do is try and use examples that are not from the common positions and arguments and mythologies of biology that are used in these kinds of social contexts and circumstances. I'm going to use somewhat unusual ones, and I'm going to make points about what biological systems do with notions of unity and diversity. What does unity mean in biological terms? What does diversity mean in biological terms? And what I'm going to argue to you is that the meanings of these terms and of the implicit value judgments, if you will, in them are extraordinarily diverse within biology itself. And I suggest to you that it is important for us to take this into our understanding of what people are talking about. In bottom line, what I'm going to say is that when people tell you what biologists say, what they're really telling you is what they would like biologists to say, which is not necessarily the same thing. तो सवाल पूछे. Okay, so this is the summary. अब लेकिन भैया हिंदुस्तानी हैं, परंपराएं हैं, और ख्याल वयाल की परंपरा है, विलंबित ताल तो होना ही चाहिए. तो उसमें जब ये पूछें कि in our traditions, this is off track again, but let me go on. In our traditions, when people talk about, when my friend talks about, say it in brief, say it in brief, say it in brief. But we have a general opinion about how prolix we are. तो ऐसी कोई परंपरा है कि बिल्कुल थोड़े में कह दो? तो it turns out कि है. So since I'm doing this off the top of my head, I will make mistakes, and please everybody feel free to correct me. But how should speech be? Vakya as in that which ought to be said or that which can be said. तो वाक्य कैसा होना चाहिए? And the really nice description comes to mind. सार्थम तथ्यम हितम वाक्यम लघुयुक्तम अनुत्तरम. सार्थ होना चाहिए, तथ्य होना चाहिए, हितकर होना चाहिए, ऐसा वाक्य लघु होना चाहिए, छोटा होना चाहिए, और अनुत्तरणीय होना चाहिए, कि उसका जवाब नहीं. This is one tradition. But keep in mind that we in the subcontinent have an extraordinary diversity of traditions. So making an unanswerable argument in and of itself is not necessarily safe for you. I will remind you, in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, there are more than one, but there is one Yajnavalkya Gargi संवाद. तो गार्गी जी ने सवाल पूछे, याज्ञवल्क्य जी जवाब दे रहे थे, फिर एक सवाल पे आ गए तो याज्ञवल्क्य जी या तो उत्तर जानते नहीं थे या तो देना नहीं चाहते थे, जो कुछ है. तो जो अनुत्तरणीय सवाल पूछा गार्गी जी ने, तो याज्ञवल्क्य जी ने कहा, क्या कहा? संस्कृत पढ़े बहुत दिन हो गए. गार्गी माति प्राक्षी, do not overstep. माते मूर्धा व्यपपत तत्, यानी कि your head will fall off, तुम्हारा सर कट जाएगा. So the unanswerable question can also be addressed in our traditions with violence. ये भी एक विरासत है हमारी, ये भी एक परंपरा है. तो we have a multiplicity of traditions that we need to integrate, as Amartya Sen I think said, in our multiple identities as human beings. Anyway, so actually याज्ञवल्क्य was a very interesting character. यहाँ गार्गी जी को तो सिर्फ ये धमकी दी के सर कट जाएगा. और एक जनाब थे, क्या नाम था? Is there anybody here who remembers this stuff? एक जनाब थे, क्या नाम था? विदग्ध शाकल्य. नहीं उसी बृहदारण्यक की बात कर रहा हूँ. विदग्ध शाकल्य. तो इनकी कुछ सवाल जवाब हुए, बोलचाल हुई. फिर याज्ञवल्क्य जी ने विदग्ध शाकल्य से सवाल पूछा. और जब जवाब दे नहीं पाए, and the students will find the great resonance and sympathy in this, कि जब सवाल पूछा गया विदग्ध शाकल्य जी से और जवाब नहीं दे पाए, तो याज्ञवल्क्य जी ने ना सिर्फ उनका सर उड़ा दिया, लोमड़ियां मंगवा के उनसे सर लेगी. Jackals came and took the head of Vidagdha Shakalya away. So there are terrific consequences in our traditions for transiting from ordinary conversation into violence. Although maybe Yajnavalkya was like one of the hopefully occasional faculty members that one sees in universities. He was a character. Janak ji ne had kept a debate. Janak. And the prize of the debate was some X cows and Y gold and so on and so forth. So what did Yajnavalkya do? चेले को बुलाया और कहा ले जाओ घर. Without participating in the debate. This is not entirely unheard of amongst university faculty members as characters. So anyway, to go back to the issue of questioning, even though there are consequences to questioning, we are still talking about questioning being a tradition to respect, no matter what sort of answers you get to the questioning. After all, one of the, since I'm talking about our traditions, since one of our great sources of so-called sacred traditions says that when somebody very earnestly asked, Bhaiya, I don't understand why I'm fighting in this war, what was the answer given to him? Klaibyam asmagamah partha naitatvai upapadyate kshidram hridaya daurbalyam tyaktvo tishtha parantapa. In other words, this is unmanly, this is शोभा नहीं देता तुम्हें, ऐसे सब सवाल पूछना, क्या कर रहे हो तुम? Let us go back to the issue of questions. And when we begin to ask questions about the state of society, what we really come up against is what has come up in this particular debate over and over again, which is, यार पॉलिटिक्स क्यों कर रहे हो? सबने सुना है? हाँ? यूनिवर्सिटी है, पॉलिटिक्स क्यों कर रहे हो? So the reality is that कहाँ नहीं है? हाँ? अरे भैया हर घर में है. तो करने ना करने की बात नहीं है, मानने ना मानने की बात है. So, and this is where विलंबित खत्म करके थोड़ा मैं वृत्त पे आऊं कि this is where people begin to make these implicit distinctions that even Dhruv made, which is कि साइंस का जिक्र अभी तक नहीं हुआ, यानी कि सोशल साइंस का जिक्र हुआ, लेकिन सोशल साइंस कोई असली साइंस नहीं है. तो अब पलायनवाद का स्वीकार कर रहे हैं. तो सोचते तो हम हैं, सोशल साइंस और नेचुरल साइंस के बारे में हम अलग अलग सोचते हैं, एक कहीं ना कहीं दिमाग में अलग सी सोच रखते हैं. क्यों रखते हैं? वजह क्या है, उसका मूल क्या है? तो मे बी थिंक अबाउट इट दिस वे. मैं कोई उत्तर देने नहीं आया हूं, मैं सिर्फ बहस छेड़ने आया हूं. मे बी थिंक अबाउट इट दिस वे कि जब हम नेचुरल साइंस की बात करते हैं, we see natural science as being outside social interactions. We see social science as being imbued with social interactions. And we therefore think that somehow these two are different. और जहाँ तक कि हमारी अपनी बात है तो उसमें पॉलिटिक्स बहुत ज़्यादा आएगा सोशल साइंस में, और नेचुरल साइंस में तो पॉलिटिक्स है ही नहीं. Right? That some version of this notion is what we all carry. And my problem with that notion is at many levels. But for the purpose of this conversation, I suggest to you that a major outcome of this, perhaps an unlooked for outcome of this, is that we begin to use tentative small explanatory models from the natural sciences, and particularly from the life sciences, but from others also, as universal truths to be imported by analogy into discourses of societal import. All said and done, argument by analogy is yet another of our major philosophical traditions, right? Pinda Brahmanda Nyaya. So there's all of this. And what that does is it creates, reinforces, and writes into stone the idea of myths as scientific truths. And I'm arguing, therefore, that if at all we are going to contest this, we are going to have to examine detail, without which it cannot be done. And that's why a couple of examples. The issue of, as soon as you say science, particularly life science, and in the context of society, many people, many of my friends said, yaar tum wo, as I said, caste genetics pe baat karo. And simply in a spirit of perversity, let me not talk about that, but talk about something going a little bit further back, a few tens of thousands of years further back. And let us talk about what biologically, for our broad species group, ideas of diversity and unity have meant. So think about the human genome sequencing. What the world community of life scientists did almost 20 years ago now is sequenced the human genome. But there is no such thing as the human genome. Because if you say the human genome, that's a singularity, that's a unity, that's one thing. And if you look at ourselves, we're clearly not one thing, we're not copies. So, what are the sources of this immense diversity? Simply in appearances that we have. So there's all this argument about nature and nurture, which we will get into it later if time permits. But the problem with the human genome as an idea at its core is this: there is no such thing. There is an approximation. Somebody has put together a group of sequences of DNA from one person. Actually, from, if there are biologists here, they will remind me of 3 people or 4 people. But a mixture of 3 or 4 people, DNA from a mixture of 3 or 4 people was sequenced. And what we are looking at as the human genome is actually an approximate guess at best. We've done better simply by virtue of technology, and therefore the approximation has become less and less and less, sure, but it's still an approximation. One of the consequences of that sequencing and of the sequencing and other ways of identifying genetic differences between individuals that have grown up out of that process has been a fair amount of support for the out of Africa hypothesis that has been in the limelight for many years now as the explanation for the origins of humanity. And the argument there is that as a species, we came out of Africa, whether before the Sumatran volcano erupted or a little bit before and a little bit after is still open to question and debate, but we did. We came out of Africa and we migrated here, there, everywhere, and our argument therefore has been most dramatically posited in old hyperbole in the pages of scientific journals about identifying Eve, identifying Adam, or hum sab hain hi Adam aur Hawa ki santan, so there's all of that. And then people began saying, such? Really? Is that quite correct? Has anybody taken a careful look at the data? And people began taking a careful look at the data. Parallelly, people began doing genetic sequencing, gene sequencing from non-human species. This is as different as you can get, completely different. Something like we are Homo sapiens in formal nomenclature terms, the Neanderthals are Homo neanderthalensis. So Neanderthal DNA was sequenced. And then somebody went and said, yeah, but keh rahe hain कि if you look at human genome sequences, more than 90% of the human genome sequence shows evidence of having come out of Africa, and therefore, you know, we're all one lineage that has come out of Africa. And then people began looking at sequences a little more carefully, and it turns out कि हम में Neanderthal genes भी हैं. Consider the kind of problems to the idea of species unity, species homogeneity that this creates. Because it says effectively, as one interpretative explanation, that we, as one species, have crossbred at some point in our ancient evolutionary history with another species. What happened to unity? What happened to homogeneity? And what happens to these great biological myths that are written in stone in public discourse? This is not simply true of the Neanderthals. This is true of other non-human Homo lineages such as the Denisovans, for example, who are, well, as far as anybody can tell, they were far closer relatives of the Neanderthals than of Homo sapiens. The bottom line in all of this is the clear divisions of species diversity between species and unity and homogeneity within species is not as clear-cut as that. And surely the old gentleman with a much longer beard, Darwin, knew this perfectly well. because he suggested, or at least the explanation that he suggested has grown to a very interesting perspective of what diversity and unity might mean in biological terms, which is that we generate a random diversity amongst ourselves, and then from random diversity, and I'm going to use a phrase that I absolutely hate, by survival of the fittest, please see quotation marks around the phrase, survival of the fittest, very, very good people come to populate the earth. Right? This is a fairly common notion around the world. तो पहली बात यह है कि डार्विन ने ऐसा कुछ नहीं कहा, लेकिन भैया डार्विन साहब को मर के does anybody remember कितने साल हो गए? काफी साल हो गए. तो पुरानी बातें क्यों निकालें? Let us simply say कि the reality is we have no idea of what fitness means. We really don't. As a matter of fact, what we think of as fitness is simply a matter of local contingent circumstances. उस वक्त क्या है, उस वक्त कैसे है. तो इसके लिए एक उदाहरण देता हूं. मैं तो यूनिवर्सिटी में नहीं पढ़ा, मैं मेडिकल कॉलेज में गया. तो जब मेडिकल कॉलेज में हम गए तो मेडिकल कॉलेज में तो कोई बहस नहीं सिखाता. मेडिकल कॉलेज में याद करना पड़ता है. तो वो बात छोड़. तो मेडिकल कॉलेज में when I was in medical college, which is now, you know, like 40 years back, but pretty much Darwin's time. So when I was in medical college, there was a major problem with typhoid fever. Everybody's heard of typhoid fever? There was a major problem with typhoid fever. एक एंटीबायोटिक था जो हमारे सीनियर्स के जमाने में काफी अच्छा काम करता था. कहते थे क्लोरैम्फेनिकोल, क्लोरोमाइसिटिन दे दो बस काम कर जाएगा, और काम करता था. जहां तक हो सकता है काम करता था. But by the time we were senior medical students, it became very apparent that the new strains of the bacterium, जो microbe है typhoid fever को, what am I missing in Hindi, which generates typhoid fever, so that microbe had become resistant to chloromycetin. Everybody's heard of antibiotic resistance? So the microbe had become resistant to chloromycetin. So there was a general opinion amongst physicians कि अब chloromycetin नहीं दे दो भैया क्योंकि काम नहीं करता. As a result, what happened? Slowly, but over years, people stopped using chloromycetin. No surprise. Now you would think that if an organism, if a bacterium has become resistant to chloromycetin, and that is why in a community which is getting typhoid fever and is transmitting typhoid fever, क्योंकि you know we are our waste disposal systems are what they are, and therefore we tend to spread this stuff because we don't deal with public health in any effective fashion. But the organism has become resistant to chloromycetin. उसकी फिटनेस बढ़ गई. ठीक है ना? सब माने कि उसकी फिटनेस बढ़ गई. It has now become, because it has competed and it has survived, जब बाकी सब मर गए, लेकिन इसकी फिटनेस बढ़ी. तो इसकी फिटनेस बढ़ी तो अनादिकाल तक इसकी फिटनेस बढ़ी रहनी चाहिए ना. 10 साल पहले जब लोग देखने लगे कि एंटीबायोटिक रेजिस्टेंस की प्रोफाइल क्या है, आजकल के जो टाइफाइड फीवर के बैक्टीरिया हैं उनकी, तो उनमें से कई सारे क्लोरोमाइसिटिन को सेंसिटिव हैं. ये कैसे हो गया? If fitness increases as an absolute value, remember what we keep doing. This is why I'm saying we make these transitions from tentative ideas that are contingent in the natural sciences into broad brush mythologies in public discourse. So has fitness increased in some global value term? Not at all. All that happened was, उस वक्त काफी एंटीबायोटिक इधर उधर था, तो जो रेजिस्टेंट था वो बढ़ा. But in order to be resistant to the antibiotic, बेचारे बैक्टीरिया को भी कुछ काम करना पड़ा ना. It had to make something that would allow it to become resistant. वो जो कुछ बना रहा था, whatever protein the bacterium was making, whatever he is a good term to use for bacteria. Whatever he was making, or whatever the species, whatever the population was making, for protecting itself against an antibiotic, was a great advantage when the antibiotic was there. But it became a great drag when the antibiotic is not there. क्योंकि वो तो बनाया जा रहा है, बाहर एंटीबायोटिक है ही नहीं बिठवा, है ना? तो उसके जो प्रतिस्पर्धी है, उनका काम 50 प्रोटीन बना के चल जा रहा है, ये 51वां भी बना रहा है. तो जब ज्यादा बना रहा है तो ज्यादा खाना पड़ेगा. और जब ये होता है तो in competitive terms, you now have the situation that the resistant bacterium is less fit. The ideas of survival of the fittest are this extraordinarily plastic and contingent on circumstances. This is a major issue, and as I said, I'm purely for perverse reasons not going to use ordinary, regular examples of diversity. I'm going to use other examples. So let me give you another example. कहते हैं, especially in my field, मैं immunology में काम करता हूँ, यानी कि प्रतिरक्षा विज्ञान में काम करता हूँ. I and my colleagues work on how the body, human body, is what we are interested in, but we use other kinds of models as well. How the body protects itself, right? Straightforward. And every time, and this is absolutely classic, every time people in my field, my discipline, begin to talk about immune response, the analogy drawn is of war. It's a very, क्या कहते हैं, just war doctrine? Everybody's heard of this? So it's a very just war doctrine kind of argument made by analogy. The argument is the body fights a defensive war because the body is attempting to protect its unity and integrity. Everybody's heard this terminology. Right? And since all of us are here, each one of us at this point in time have at least won the battle, right? That's the interpretation? Or at least it should be the interpretation? ये तो मंजूर है आपको? तो ये सवाल पूछें कि एक मानव शरीर ले लें ऐसे मनुष्य का कि जो मनुष्य कल्याण के लिए अपना शरीर देने को तैयार हैं. ध्रुव भैया हाथ ऊपर कर रहे हैं. तो और everybody is familiar कि शरीर कोशिकाओं का बना हुआ है. The body is made up of cells. तो अपन ये करें, never mind how, अपन ये करें कि we disassemble Professor Dhruv Raina's body into its composite cells. पूरे जैसे हैं वैसे ले लें and collect cells. Your expectation is that every cell in that test tube full of formerly Dhruv Raina cells will consist of Dhruv Raina's cell, correct? That's obvious. More than half of those cells are not his cells at all. More than half of those cells are bacteria. Because your body, half the cell count in your body is actually bacteria. Now, you can debate कि exactly half है क्या. कोई कहता है 30% है, कोई कहता है 70% है. यार काफी बैक्टीरिया हैं. ठीक है ना? If we have been fighting this immune response war in order to protect the sovereign territorial unity and integrity of our bodies, what is this bacteria doing in Dhruv Raina's test tube? So it turns out that immune responses don't actually function like that. Do they kill bacteria? Sure. Do they quite frequently not kill bacteria? Sure. How do they decide? That's a career. Trying to figure out how they decide. But zahir hai, when half the cells in your body are not your own, there is something wrong with the simplified notion of immune response as defensive war. And as I was saying this, I was wondering whether I need to underline the implications of this, but I clearly don't. So I will simply go on telling you the story for a few more minutes. अब ये पूछिएगा कि this is a diversity. In your body, this is a diversity. Is this simply a diversity that we tolerate? है ना? Is this simply a diversity that we tolerate? तो प्रयोग किया जा सकता है. प्रयोग क्या है? अब इंसान को लेना तो मुश्किल है, लेकिन चूहे को ले सकते हैं. और चूहा ले लो और पूरी चूहे की नस्ल स्टेराइल बबल में रखो. So effectively what you are doing is, by virtue of engineering technology, you make a germ-free, microbe-free environment, and you keep mice, you breed mice within that environment. Do they live? Yeah, sure. खान पान होता है, सब कुछ होता है. They live, they breed, everything is okay. No, everything is not okay. So it turns out that in mice that have no exposure to germs, immune system का आप सोचोगे कोई काम ही नहीं है. लेकिन their body parts don't necessarily all develop properly. If you look at their immune organs, if you look at their lymph nodes, if you look at सबको खांसी जुकाम हुई है, gland swell under your jaw, lymph nodes. तो these lymph nodes are organs. तो अपने आप बनने चाहिए. यार बाहरी मदद क्यों लगती है? अपने आप नहीं बना सकते. And the answer is नहीं बना सकते. As a matter of fact, many organs in the body are developmentally dependent on signals that look remarkably like signals that the immune system uses when it responds to microbes. What it does in response to microbes, number one, is quite frequently what it also uses, thoda ghuma phira ke, to build its own organs. And number two, some of that organ building exercise, it simply cannot complete if there are no microbes. This is one thing. The second thing that is wrong with these mice, which are germ-free, is that they are really not very well. Vitamin nahi hota, what else? Some amino acids, some small hormone mimetics, all sorts of things, they're deficient in. Why are they deficient in it? Because it is bacteria in your gut that are making all of this. तो आप कहोगे कि यार, but the bacteria are in your gut, वो तो अंदर नहीं जाते ना, मतलब अंदर हैं लेकिन अंदर से अंदर नहीं जाते ना, तो उस वजह से उनके खिलाफ डिफेंस करने की कोई जरूरत नहीं पड़ती। सरासर झूठ है। सरासर झूठ क्यों है? मोहतरमा से पूछिएगा, वहां बैठी हैं, कि जब आपकी आंत में जितने बैक्टीरिया हैं उनकी जांच तलाश करे तो 2/3 से ज्यादा बैक्टीरिया के ऊपर एंटीबॉडीज हैं। इसका मतलब ये कि आपका शरीर उनके खिलाफ इम्यून रिस्पांस बना चुका है, फिर भी वो वहीं के वहीं है, और वो जो कर रहे हैं उससे आपको भी फायदा हो रहा है। These are the contingent complexities of immune responses. The trivial, linear, foolish narrative of all-out war is simply not biological. It's human. Up. How much time do I have? Okay. So, जब डॉक्टर मोहनराव कहते हैं कि ओवर, तो यार क्या करें? So, one last point about diversity and the sheer value of diversity. You take cells in your body. In the first place, every one of your cells actually has a somewhat different genome sequence. लेकिन उसे छोड़ दीजिएगा. There are cells in your body which do not have your entire genetic complement. And these are the cells in your body, for example, that make antibodies. And everybody's heard of antibodies. Let's not worry about what they are and so on and so forth. Everybody's heard of antibodies. Vaccines दे दिए जाते हैं, antibodies बनती हैं, protection करती हैं, वगैरह वगैरह वगैरह. Now, if you take the cells that make antibodies, every one of those cells individually, we're talking about billions of cells, every one of those cells is different from every other cell. The diversity of your antibody repertoire is immense. We're talking about diversity in the millions, right? Here is an example of a diversity in your body of your own cells. So you turn around and you ask the same question. Is this diversity simply being tolerated? या इसका कोई मतलब भी है? And repeatedly over the past 15 years, and that's why I'm going to stop here, because I'm now referring to relatively recent biological science in the making. Over the past 15 years, it has steadily become more and more apparent that as we restrict the diversity of the antibody repertoire, so we limit the ability of the body to make effective immune responses against microbial diseases. There is positive value in diversity, even in biological systems. So last point, or more correctly, an epilogue. What I'm trying to say is, when we find something that we think is problematic, we have options and choices. One option is पीठ फेर के चले जाएं और ये कहें कि इसका कोई मतलब नहीं. The other option is खड़े होके पूछें, अच्छा सचमुच सबूत है? क्या है? समझाइयो तो. Because ultimately, everything that we're trying to do deals with trying to build more and more nuanced, more and more complex models of understanding. That's what scholarship is about. That's what universities are about. Many of my friends in the natural sciences have this tendency of saying, यार ये social science अपन कुछ नहीं समझते, वो क्या करते हैं? We are looking for objective truth. सुना है? हाँ। तो अब सत्य के साथ मेरा बड़ा पेचीदा रिश्ता है, क्योंकि सत्य के कई पहलू हैं. And I will remind you again of our own tradition in terms of the dimensions and perspectives of truth. Again, याद होना चाहिए. सभा है तो सभा के बारे में कहें, नसा सभा यत्र न संति वृद्धा. That is not a sabha where there are no vriddhas, there are no elders. Nate vruddha yena vadanti dharmam. That those are not elders who do not talk about the right way. Nasau dharmo yatra cha nasti satyam. That is not the right way, which does not have truth. And the last line, natat satyam yat chalena anuviddham. वो सत्य नहीं है जो छल छलावे से ओतप्रोत और बंधा हुआ है.